We've all grown up saying it over and over and over and over and over again. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God. We've been reminded many of the great historical realities tied to both the founding and the development of what has, or what was and is, I guess, continually the American experiment. We are being confronted with images of our nation and the challenges of our nation. The war in Iraq and the war against terrorism and all of the things that confront us both at home and abroad. We know that our nation is in great tension during these days. The phrase in our Pledge of Allegiance that causes great consternation, great conflict, and great debate is, what do you mean by one nation under God? The problem is, you've got God in here and you got government in here. And the question on the floor is, how do the two relate to one another? You will hear it everywhere I go. It comes up in one form or another, and that is the relationship of God and government. The great tension of what it means to follow God and yet to live in a democracy, or what it probably more accurately should be, and I'll define this in a moment, a constitutional republic. And this is a growing issue. This issue will not go away. It is an issue in the international scene when we have to deal with countries that are ecclesiocracies, that is, run by institutional religion. It is an issue when we adopt a school in our own context, because the question is raised, well, what about the separation of church and state? It is raised when I'm asked to go pray at a civic event, and on occasion I've been asked, would I not mention the name Jesus? It's not a side issue. It's not a peripheral issue. It is at the warp and woof of the culture. And how do we deal with this from a biblical frame of reference? Now, one has only to read the Bible casually to know the Bible is thick with politics. I mean, you got two books of the Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings, dealing with the rule and reign of government leaders. You've got Jeremiah rebuilding communities with government support. You've got Daniel going high in the governments of Babylon and Persia. You've got John the Baptist interacting with Herod. You got Jesus having to deal with the political tensions of Pilate. You got Israel and the tensions that they're living under Rome. You got over and over and over and over again, God's involvement with politics and government is inescapable simply from a casual reading of the Bible. The question that we want to raise today, or speak to today, is not the question of, do religion and politics mix? That's not the question. The question is, how do they mix? What is the relationship that we ought to have as Christians, and we ought to have, particularly as a congregation of Christians, of the church, or churches ought to have? I mean, we face it in elections. Most African American Christians are Democrats. They believe that the Democratic Party is more sensitive to the social and justice needs of minority, the poor, and the disenfranchised. Most Anglo-Christians are Republican. They believe that the Republican Party most sensitively is committed to the moral issues of our day, anti-abortion, anti-homosexual rights, and the redefinition of the family. So you got one group of Christians who emphasize the moral issues, and therefore they vote Republican. You got another group of Christians who emphasize justice issues, and so they vote Democratic. And what that has brought about to a large degree is a divided church. Now, you know something is wrong when the Church of Jesus Christ is divided along political lines. You know you got a problem if the Church of Jesus Christ allows politics and its concomitant realities to bring about a division, and it has. And that's why 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is probably still the most segregated hour in America, because political expediency often overrides the kingdom of God. And so I want to just address this. It's such a big subject that you can't fully enunciate all of the idiosyncrasies related to it, but what I would like to do is to kind of give you a framework that at least an understanding of God's view on the matter can be formed as a template for your own thinking and for moving forward in the future in your own Christian life, because we do live in society and we do live under government regime, and yet we're still Christians and we're part of the Church of Jesus Christ. There are a lot of passages that I could go to. I will go to one or feature one that most people have never even read. It was read in your hearing this morning from Ezekiel chapter 43. And then I will reference a few other passages in relationship to it, so that hopefully you will have a template as a way of thinking as we progress. And I guess this is somewhat on my mind because it is a major issue in our society today. Ezekiel is addressing a problem, and that is the departure of the glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord has taken flight. God's presence was no longer being experienced in the society. God had distanced himself from his people. He no longer demonstrated his glory. God's glory is the manifestation of his attributes, where God was being seen and experienced and felt, and his power was being manifested. That's God's glory. It's where God shows out because of who he is. They could not find God. God had left the temple. God tells them one of the main reasons he left the temple, one of the main reasons his glory departed. And when his glory departed from the temple, his glory departed from the culture. Because the temple, the place of worship, was where his glory resided, and it was where his glory resided that was supposed to feed out from there, be a feeder system into the broader society. But when his glory, Ichabod, when the glory of the Lord departed the place of worship, then he was no longer, not only not seen in the temple, he was no longer seen in the culture. And as a result, chaos came into the culture. Crime and social deterioration, social disintegration, stuff just began to disappear, and chaos took place because the glory of the Lord had departed. In chapter 43, the glory of the Lord is about to return. And I'll show you that in a moment. But the glory of the Lord is about to return. And Ezekiel, in his vision, is reciting the return of the glory of the Lord, but in reciting the return of the glory of the Lord, he also recites why the glory of the Lord left. And in reciting the glory of the Lord leaving the temple, which meant leaving the culture, he makes a very interesting statement in verses 7 through 9. He said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the sons of Israel forever. And the house of Israel will not again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their harlotry and by their corpses of their kings when they die. How did they do this? Verse 8, by setting their threshold by my threshold, and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only the wall between me and them. And they have defiled my holy name by their abominations which they have committed, so I have consumed them in my anger. God says that the human kings, which was the government in biblical days, the human kings were allowed to put their throne next to his throne. In other words, government was allowed to intrude on the rule of God. Government was allowed to get so close to God that there were 2 thrones in God's house. There was the throne of the government, and there was the throne of God in God's house. Now, he starts off by making it inexplicably clear that my throne is in my house. But you let your kings set up their thrones next to my throne. So you got 2 kings in my house. You got human kings, human government, and you got me, and you treating us like we equals. You have allowed politics, if you will, government, to intrude, and when government came in, the kings, it says they brought their abominations with them. So when the government came in, it came in and it brought its view of things, which was not my view of things. He calls it harlotry here, which was a form of idolatry, a mixing of a relationship that was illegitimate, an illegitimate relationship between church and state, between government and God. The temple was God's throne. Well, what do you do on a throne? You rule. A throne is where somebody rules. It says, in this house, and he's going to say that a number of times in a moment to make sure we don't get the message. In this house, it's my throne. I run the show in this house. Don't be bringing kings up in this house who will challenge, contradict, or invalidate my throne. Don't let them bring their throne to mess with my throne. At the heart of the doctrine of the separation of the church and state is to never be a separation between God and government. As long as you know that God says, in this house, my throne rules. The temple was God's residence, but the kings had defiled God's name by bringing civil religion into the church and turning the church into the American flag. Now, I am a consummate American. The Bible says, honor the king and honor the country. And so it is very valid to honor where you live and where God has placed you. But there are limitations. And the limitations is when these 2 thrones are made equal. He calls it an abomination to bring in your politics and allow them to contradict the throne of God. Now, please don't misunderstand me, as I'm going to show you in a moment. God is not against government. In fact, you're going to say in a second, God established government. But he didn't establish it to compete with him. He established it to serve him. And he certainly didn't establish it to compete with him in his house, which in this case was the temple. So first of all, we have to make clear, what is this relationship between God and government? Well, there are a lot of places we could go, but let me just start with probably the premier scripture on the subject, and that is Romans chapter 13. Every person is to be, verse 1 says, into subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed it will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For government, it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. Now, the point I want to bring up here is he makes the clear statement, the goal of government is to act on God's behalf in promoting good and limiting evil. The fundamental job of government is to promote good in society and keep bad from proliferating in society. And that can happen on business levels and civic levels and all those kinds of things. Proverbs chapter 8 verse 15 says, by me kings reign and rulers decree justice. The world, brothers and sisters, is a theocracy. Theo, God, ocracy, rule. The world is ruled by God. God has set up systems in the world by which he rules, and these systems are called government systems. There are 3 government systems in the Bible. The family is a governmental system. Why? Because it has a jurisdiction and it has consequences tied to behavior. The church is a governmental system. It has been given a certain jurisdiction with responsibilities tied to behavior. Then there is civil government, which is a jurisdiction, and it has to do with the order of society. And God says, I run them all. I sit on the throne, and I give the guidelines by which all 3 of those institutions work. The family, the church, and the civil government. Now, what he is saying is, I don't want them telling me what to do. That's the bottom line. I can tell them, they can't tell me. We are not equals. Don't allow the institutions, and I can apply it to any of them, although talking about civil government, he would say to a man in the house, he would say, you the head of the house, kinda. You're the head of the house underneath me. 1 Corinthians 11:3 says. Tony Evans, you're the shepherd of this house. Kinda. You are underneath me. The moment that any institutional leader extracts himself from God, he is no longer governing God's way. But when you allow that to enter into God's house, you have messed with his throne. And what God did, watch what God did. His glory departed. That is, if you want government to rule independently of me, or you're going to compromise my throne with that throne, then I'm going to find someplace else to hang out. It is the job of government to reflect a theocracy that already exists. It is the job of the family to reflect a rule that already exists, and that is God's rule. Families are fine, but they're to complement God's rule. Churches are fine, and to complement God's rule. Civil government is fine, it's to complement God's rule. So the glory of the Lord left because the kings were allowed to have a position that was unauthorized by God in God's house. Now, I would like to suggest that one of the problems we face today is that we have allowed politics to dictate to the kingdom of God. Far too many black Christians are too democratic. They're too committed to the Democratic Party. Far too many Anglo-Christians are too Republican. They are too committed to the Republican Party. Why? Because they're committed to a fault. And they're committed to a party because it's a party when everything is supposed to be overruled by the throne. I love the story in Joshua 5. You don't have to turn there. But Joshua is getting ready to go into battle. He's getting ready to go to war. And he's getting ready to go up against his enemy. And this other army comes alongside with this huge guy who's a captain, and he's leading this huge army. Now, Joshua's mama ain't raised no dummy. Joshua has a real question here. Joshua said, I'm getting ready to go fight these folks, but here this army that I don't know anything about has come out of nowhere. I'm going to fight them, and then this other group is over here, and I don't know who they are. So let me find out who these folks are. Because he says, if they are fighting with them, then I got to rethink my position. All right? But if they are fighting with us, well, now I'm good to go. So he goes and he asks the captain of the army, whose side are you on? See, Joshua was no dummy. He won't know whether I'm fighting one army or two. So he goes and he says, sir, whose side are you on? The captain, the head of the army, looked at Joshua and made a powerful statement. He said, I am neither on your side, nor am I on their side. And then he says, I am captain of the Lord's army. Translation, I did not come to take sides, I come to take over. Until you and I understand God does not ride the backs of donkeys or elephants. He has his own throne. He makes his own rules. And sometimes that's going to come out on the side of Republicans, and sometimes that's going to come out on the side of Democrats. But if you are so committed to a king or to a political persuasion, how in the world can you be so democratic that you can support homosexual rights? Ain't that much Democrat in the world. Just because you're more socially sensitive and you're concerned about justice doesn't give you the biblical right to overrule the throne of God on that issue. But we got political leaders who believe in God, who will come in the house of God and endorse gay rights in the name of supporting. That is an abomination. But on the other side of the ledger, you cannot be so committed as a Republican to protecting the life in the womb that you forget fairness to the tomb. You can't be so committed to caring that nobody aborts the baby, but not care about the kind of life the baby gets to live once it leaves the womb. God is interested in whole life, not term. He's interested in womb to tomb. But because we have become so committed to the kings, that is, to a political persuasion, regardless of the fact that it competes with the throne of God, that we have turned many of our pulpits into governmental or political playgrounds instead of representing the throne room of God, irrespective of a particular political persuasion. Look, I don't care what you are. You can come in here as a Democrat. You can come in here as a Republican. Just know when you come in here, there is another throne. As long as you understand that. He says, you let the kings put their stuff next to me. And that was an abomination. You say, well, Jesus told Pilate. Pilate said, look, Pilate asked him a question in John 19, and Jesus didn't answer. And Pilate said, don't you know who I am? And Pilate's a governmental leader. He said, don't you know who I am? Jesus said, do you know who I am? Jesus told Pilate, he said, the only authority you have is the authority my Father gives you. Now, this is a pagan leader. It's not a Christian, but he simply tells them the only authority you have is delegated authority. And that's true of any governmental regime. Even if it doesn't recognize it, it only operates with delegated authority. You know, Isaiah 6 says, in the year King Uzziah died, Isaiah saw the Lord. Where was the Lord? Sitting on the throne. Remember that? Okay, because he was in the temple. He was sitting on the throne. Well, that story has some roots. King Uzziah died. Now, we know that, but a lot of people don't know why King Uzziah died. King Uzziah is the government. He's the king. Well, guess what King Uzziah did in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 16? He went in the house of God. King Uzziah went into the house of God to do what was illegitimate. He brought his governmental authority into God's house and sought to overrule. It says the priest said, stop, you have no authority here to do that. You're out of line, king. But Uzziah used his political power and insisted. In the year King Uzziah died, Isaiah saw, in the year the Republicans lost, in the year the Democrats lost, God was still sitting on the throne. That's why you can't be too committed to Uzziah. Because see, if you're too committed to him, you're going to find out that you done lost power in the Senate and the House and the White House. And you're going to be mad for 4 years. Because if you're too committed to Uzziah, there is only one throne. And one throne only. And God does not want the political realm. He wants us involved in politics. Absolutely. God has set up politics. Any Christian who refuses to vote, any Christian who refuses to take their civic responsibility seriously is nullified. It's like a father who's failing the father, or a mother who's failing the mother, or a pastor who's failing the shepherd. A citizen who refuses to meet their civic governmental responsibility is failing the kingdom of God. But in fulfilling that responsibility, you've got to remember, as a believer, there's only one throne. In Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17, it says the leaders, the pagan leaders, sought to trick Jesus. And they brought to him a question. The question was, do we pay the poll tax? So it has to do with taxes. And come to Jesus. That's why I like the Bible. The Bible talks about everything. I mean, everything. And you may not catch it immediately, but if you look at it, it talks about everything. So do we pay taxes? Do we pay the poll tax? All right? I know some of you really want the answer to this one. Do we pay the income tax? Do we pay the tax? It says it was a trick bag. That's a trick question. It was a catch-22. Why was it a catch-22? Because if he said don't pay taxes, then they could go back to the government and say you got a tax evader here. But if you say to pay taxes, you're paying taxes to Caesar, who declared he was God. So now you're worshiping another God. So they got Jesus in this catch-22 where it's a no-win question. He's either against the government or he's against God. And they use tactics to raise the question. They had it. They knew they had it. At least they thought they had it. Mark chapter 12 says, Jesus said, why are you trying to trick me? He said, bring me a coin. So they bring him a coin. And he said, now, whose inscription is on this coin? And they said, well, Caesar's inscription is on this coin. Jesus said, well, now, if Caesar's inscription is on this coin, then this must be Caesar's coin. Because Caesar's name is on it. So since it's Caesar's coin, because Caesar's name is on it, give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And it's Caesar's coin because his name is on it. Let me put it in common terminology. Whose name is on your dollar bill? It's the U.S. Treasury. That's on your money. That's what. So that is money tied to government. So render unto government what belongs to government. If government's providing you services, if government's providing you protection, then since that's what's written on that, then give to government what government deserves. So that takes care of that part of it. Because Caesar's name is on it. But now render, he goes and says, render unto God that which belongs to God. Now the question is, what belongs to God? Answer is everything. It says after he answered them, it says they marveled. In other words, you give to the government what is the government. You give to God what's God's. But what you don't do is allow the government to take what belongs to God. So they were stuck. He goes on, he says, now, the glory of the Lord is returning. See, the glory of the Lord is returning. Let me read the verse here, the last verse of 42, just before you get to 43, verse 1. Let me set this context. If you go all the way back to chapter 40, and if you read it, you got all these details about how to measure the temple, how to measure God's house. Verse after verse after verse, he gives them technical details about how this thing is supposed to work. He says in the last verse of 42, he measured it on the four sides. It had a wall around it. The temple had a wall around it, okay? You know about the wall of separation between church and state. He said he measured and put a wall around it, the length 500 and the width 500, and it divided between the holy and the profane. So let's talk about this wall of separation between church and state. He put a wall around his house. He said the purpose of the wall was to separate the holy from the profane. That is, it was to separate what is God's and what is not. All right? There was a wall. In other words, don't bring the profane up in here. All right? This is my house. And my throne is in my house. So don't bring the profane up in here. Now watch this. Then, when they had finished the house, putting the house together, he led me to the gate facing the east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming. Now, here's my point. When was the glory coming back? The glory was coming back when the house was right. You see, you didn't get that. God didn't show back up till the house was right. God wasn't going to come back to a house that was still compromising with kings. But he said, when you got my house right and you build a wall with the proper separation, which is always a jurisdiction separation. Government has one jurisdiction, church has another jurisdiction, but there is no religious separation because I'm king of all, but I operate from my house. He says, when the house was ready, I saw the glory of the Lord. When the house was built according to the specifications of God's guidelines. Now, verse 10 of chapter 43. As for you, son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel. Describe, you'd say, the church to the nation. That they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the plan. Let them look at the plan I put down for the house. If they are ashamed of all they have done, which one of the main things was an illegitimate use of politics, make known to them the design of the house, its structure, its exits. Go and tell them the details of this house and write it in their sight. Now, I'm going to close with this one. Watch this now. Write it down. Write down the details of my house to the whole nation, so that they may observe the whole design and its statutes and do them. This is the law of the house. The entire area on top of the mountain, all around it, shall be most holy. Behold, this is the law of the house. All of us have a house. We'll call it our throne room, the place where we live with family. I am sure you, like me, have rules that govern your house. First of all, those are rules for your family members. That is, those who live in your house operate by those rules. But you also have rules for visitors who come to your house. When children bring their friends to your house, I think most of you would say, if your teenage son brought in his teenage boys and they were cussing up a storm in your house, the fact that they were not your kids becomes irrelevant. Because they're in your house. See, once they come into your house, now all of a sudden, your rules apply. You can't change how they talk outside of your house. But once they cross the wall into your house, they now have to function by your rule. If your kid come in smoking weed, I think, at least I hope, somebody gonna say something. You can't smoke reefer and weed in my house. Why? Because it's my house. All right? I got certain rules. If you got to drink Jack Daniels, you can't drink Jack Daniels in my house. But I don't care that you've always drunk Jack Daniels. I don't care that Jack is your best friend. All of that becomes insignificant, because once you cross the wall, you are in my house. That means that you must adjust. Well, guess what the Church of Jesus Christ has been doing? We've not been going by the law of the house. We've been going by the law of the secular world and letting it into the house. We've been letting the drug addicts run the house. We've been letting the prostitutes run the house. We've been letting the profane run the house, and we wonder why the glory of the Lord ain't hanging out in the house. He says, you show them the plan and tell them this is the law of the house. Because it's my house. Well, we be doing favors for folk. We do it for you. Doing favors for folk when it's against the law of the house. In Deuteronomy 17, God says, the king is to read my word every day, along with the priest. That's government and religion. Because my throne rules all of it. Now, you can't make government read it. You can't make government read it. But you can't let the government that doesn't read it bring their non-reading perspective in my house. let me answer a question because it's probably on somebody's mind. Based on what you're saying today, why did you let the President of the United States come to Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship and talk? Okay, how does that relate? Answer that is real simple. Faith-based initiative. He was invited for one reason and one reason alone. Because in 1996, I gave him the idea of using the churches as the primary social service delivery system for good works in the community. He adopted the idea as governor and started in Texas the faith-based initiative. He happened to become president, and nobody becomes president without God's okay. He happened to become president, and he instituted the faith-based initiative in the United States. And since that is a biblical role that the church delivers good works to the society, and since he set it up, then he was allowed to talk about the role of the church in delivering good works to the broader society, which is in keeping with the law of the house. Since it's in keeping with the law of the house, then he was allowed to agree with the law of the house. If it was a Democrat who heard my message and came up with the faith-based initiative, he would have been allowed to come because it would have agreed with the law of the house. But if you don't agree with the law of the house, you can't bring your law into this house. You gotta be with the law of the house. So my challenge to you, very personally and very practically, is to maximize your political power and potential. And know that in every political party there are great righteous goals and there are great unrighteous ones. And you just be faithful to the law of the house. And here's why. When the glory of the Lord returned to the temple, the nation was blessed. The problem in our nation is really not the problem of our nation. The problem of our nation is that the glory has left the house. That's where the problem is. Because the glory has left the house, there is nothing to overflow to the community, nothing to overflow to the nation. You bring back the glory to the house, and it becomes a blessing to the nation. May God help us to keep politics in its rightful place, and that is not compromising the law of the house.